Hey everyone, welcome to a new episode of the Whiskey Ring Podcast. We are somewhere in the high 50s in this episode. I'll have to go back and check, but I am thrilled to welcome on Monique Huston. She is, among many things, the VP of the Spirits portfolio at Winebow. She's been a keeper of the Quake, a sherry enthusiast, a lover of agave-spirits, the Scotch, and I'm bringing her on today, among many things, to talk about sherry. And we'll get to that. We've got a couple things to get to first. But first, welcome. Welcome.
Thank you, David. That was a good intro. I'm going to keep that one. I'm going to turn it into like the ringer on my phone or something.
That's fine. I could do it much better if I actually read, what I had written out. That was mostly spontaneous. But just to give people an introduction, a couple episodes ago, I had on Scott Bruno from Scotch Test Dummies, but also now Scotch Malt Whiskey Society. And I should note now Scotch Malt Whiskey Society is now an official sponsor of the podcast. So thank you to them. But I reached out to Scott and I said, I've got this question. I really want to dig more into sherry and figure out how it became important to the whiskey industry, why it's so important to it, what people are using it for. Do people still drink sherry? Is the age of Fraser gone where he's coming in and offering Niles a sherry? Which kind of, you'll tell me, but it kind of looked like maybe an Amontillado to me, but we'll see. And I really need someone who knows what they're talking about with this. Who's
out of here. That's it.
Yeah.
I'll try.
Okay, we'll try. But Scott wrote back in maybe 10 minutes and he said, Monique is the person. So no pressure.
I'm a good bridge, I would say, between the two things. I love sherry. I lived in Spain for a couple of years and loosely worked in the industry there. So that was really helpful to actually kind of submerge in the language and the culture. And Jerez is a small place, so you get kind of like small town. It was really interesting. But if I liked sherry before, I completely fell in love with it just living there. And I would highly recommend, anyone go over and spend some time in southern Spain and learn more about the interaction, the food, the culture. It's like you course sherry with every meal. And food pairings are just absolutely incredible. And then you come back and you're so excited about sherry and you wonder why no one drinks sherry in the United States anymore and why you don't see it in every bar, because it is unbelievably good with food. But really, if you love whiskey, you get those flavors. If you're into sherried whiskey, you're somebody that was drinking Macallan 18, 20 years ago,
sure.
Or a beautiful, heavily sherried, Oloroso finished whiskey now. You already love those flavors. You just might not have had as much exposure, to sherry.
Absolutely. Sherry is the way that, for me, that's the way that I got into Isla. Because I got into the smoke part through Highland Park, and then the rest of it needed a little sherry kick. But now, one of my favorite bottles, I've got a Kalila 12-year-old that was finished the entire time in sherry casks, Highland Park 16-year-old, all in sherry casks. And I've loved exploring it because you get these completely different flavors from all of them. Of course, not all of the categories of sherry are even used for whiskey maturation or finishing, but it is being seen more and more. It's been seen in the Scotch world now for a couple of decades, but we're starting to see it in American whiskey. And I will say that while we're talking, I'm drinking from Dancing Goat Distillery in Wisconsin, the Spaniard release, which is a corn whiskey finished in Oloroso sherry. It's 121 proof, and it is delicious.
It's a beautiful color. I know nobody can see us right now. I am drinking a Springbank 15. Okay. I think Springbank at 15, 21 years old in sherry is absolutely stunning. Just really, really well balanced and one of my favorite single malts. So that's what I decided to start with in honor.
Hey, absolutely. I figured I'd go a little out of the box with this one, but it was either this or the Kalila. So
yeah, you can do that next. You can't start with peat. I've got a peaty one next too.
Okay. So, I'm going to jump on that before I forget. So the last podcast I was on was someone else's podcast, my friend John at Embellish Pod. He had me on for about almost 4 hours. If you can make it through, it's a really good conversation. But towards the end, I was telling him about this discovery, quote unquote, I think I made for peat. So, usually with tastings, peat always goes at the end. You never put anything after peat. But I think I found a way around that completely by accident. So I was trying a couple of different whiskeys from a distillery in Pennsylvania, and some of their stuff is peated, some of it is unpeated. So of course I went in the normal direction. And I happened to be cleansing my palate with either saltines or pretzel salt, or saltines or pretzels. And I got to the end of the bag. I had one more to go. And I just started eating the salt from the bottom of it because I'd like to do that sometimes. I don't know how I don't have high blood pressure because I just love salt. But I was tasting it and I was eating the salt, and suddenly the smoke and the phenols started to dissipate from my palate. And I was like, this can't be a coincidence. That's like, peat never leaves your palate. You have to wait until it's ready to leave. So I looked it up, and apparently one of the ways to extract phenols in a chemical structure is to expose it to chloride salts, which NaCl, typical table salt, is exactly what it did. So we might have discovered.
You got the workaround. It's also though, peat can be, peat is an earthy tone. Smoke is a byproduct of using peat. So whiskey can also be peaty without being smoky. And smoke very often is that lingering note. And you've got lots of different kinds of peat. I mean, peat comes from different peat bogs all over the world. Peat from Tasmania in particular, which I've had a lot of experience with whiskeys, peated whiskeys from Tasmania. They're actually not very smoky. They actually can be very fruity and floral, and actually blow kind of florals and almost like a potpourri note off. And so our company used to import Lark from Tasmania, Bill Lark's single malt, and I actually started my tastings with that. And people just thought it was crazy that you would start a tasting with a peated whiskey, but it was a good lesson in the difference between peat and smoke. So it does come down to phenols, the type of phenol, the amount of phenol. And two, sometimes like a really bold, round, viscous, port matured, or maybe a PX matured whiskey can actually fare really well after a peated whiskey. So, you kind of always set up a flight, I don't know, in a classic way, but it might surprise you. So I end up finding myself bouncing around all over the place and trying them in a different order before I decide how I would group them in front of someone else. I feel like most of my career, I've just done a million Scotch tastings or whiskey tastings, beer tastings, but you have to go through those flights a number of times and be mindful, like you said, of the food. Is it purposeful? Is it for neutrality? Is it, whatever, but then you might change your mind. You might put them in a different order, especially Winebow, my company, we are a importer and distributor of spirits and wine. So we're trying to sell things to bars and restaurants and liquor stores and clubs and things like that. So we really want to put things in front of a buyer in the way that they are all going to show best. And so sometimes that means changing the order of something in a strange way that you wouldn't expect.
Absolutely. And I've always wondered, because an exception to that rule of peat at the end is, what if you're doing a flight of all peated whiskeys? It's nothing at the end. So
then then I'd probably start like low ppm, and if it's like mainland versus island versus Isla, or something like that. Yeah.
Yes. Start with the mainland, go to maybe the lowlands next, and then over to the islands and finish with the Isla. Yeah. Peat is okay. So we've got now two more episodes to do, because there's another, because peat is another thing I really want to go into. I want to do a tasting series to expose people to it. And it's really everything you just said, the fact that peat does not equal smoke, byproduct versus source. It's not all Band-Aids and rubber and iodine. Like, I got into peat through Highland Park, which I know I've said before on the podcast, so I'm sorry for the 30th time that I've said that. But there's, that's a heather smoke as opposed to a maritime seaweed type of smoke. And then there's Japanese and Danish smoke. I love Stauning, and it's a completely different profile. So like I said, that's probably multiple things, but I want to do a tasting on that just to show people you don't have to like everything. Like I cannot get through Lefroy. It's just too much for me. But last year's cartridge release with the heavy PX finishing, I could get through, because it was just enough to kind of round out what I needed and hide what I couldn't handle.
Yeah,
so
I get that. Well, I mean, that's also why there are so many of them and why it's so fascinating. It's not everything is intended for everyone, and that works out really, really well.
Yeah, and peat's it's not limited to outside the US either. I mean, Spirits of French Lick has their Whiskey Witch, which has Indiana peat in it. And you wouldn't think of Indiana as having peat, but it does. And it's in the right, we've got peat in New York, we've got peat in Pennsylvania, we've got peat all over. So that's a huge topic of exploration that I want to tackle. Right now I'm kind of in my American single malt phase, so I got to tackle all that first and then move on, but we'll get there.
We'll get there. There's a great book as you're preparing for peat. If you haven't read Peat, Smoke and Spirit by Andrew Jeffords, it is incredible. You can read straight through it, almost like a novel. If you get older copies of it, go on like eBay or go to a bookstore or something. There's some awesome pictures of folks working on Islay in the 70s and 80s. You'll recognize like a Mickey Heads who just retired from Ardbeg digging peat in his 20s. I mean, it's like you look through, it's amazing. It's such a good book. I will definitely pick that up. And all right, so this will be a good transition from where we're going. So as is on your bio, your two favorite places in the world, Scotland and Oaxaca, both quite known for smoky spirits. Even though we know that, we'll get into, we know that that's not everything there, but that's kind of what they're known for. So where did this love of both places come from? It's a good question. They're both just really special places. I've been traveling to Scotland since the late 90s, and at one point in time kind of helped lead tours there and everything else. And I'm kind of more of a small town, Midwestern gal, and I don't have an accent or anything, but Islay is just incredibly special. I mean, if you've not been there, I don't like to fly there. I don't see the point. I like to take the ferry. So you've got a couple hour-long ferry ride with a gorgeous bar, like great drams representing all the distilleries. Kind of look around on the ferry and you can almost always catch someone who works at one of the distilleries. So often it's like, if what, this distillery manager looks like, or this, whatever, it's like, oh, hey, there's a captive audience for the next 2 hours. Let me go chat to this guy who can't escape me, get all my questions answered. But, people on the island are super, super warm. And, the island is only, I think, somewhere between 5,000 and 7,000 people most of the time. And then during the Islay Festival, the Figiel, the festival of, music and whiskey and culture, you're tens of thousands of people, people caravanning and camping, but everybody makes it work. And, when you arrive there, everything is geared towards ensuring that people that love Scotch, that love Islay, or into exploring that style of whiskeys have a nice roof over their heads, are well cared for, feel welcome, are well fed, can find a driver. Like it all just is incredibly engaging and really, heartwarming. But I mean, I had some challenges with really peaty whiskeys at the beginning too. I've never had an issue with, I find that peat from Islay tends to fall into kind of a couple of camps. Like you've got some that are a little just lower on the peat scale, lower, phenolic parts per million, really approachable. So things more like Bunnahabhain or Bamor. And then you've got the really peaty ones. So from Ardbeg to Laphroaig to Octomore. And some, I find Octomore to be a lot of smoke and it's really intense, really beautiful. Laphroaig, like you were talking about before, some people will get that kind of like tire iodine Band-Aid. And then Ardbeg for me is very meaty, barbecue, fatty, leather. And I just loved that from the beginning. I just thought it was the most fascinating thing. I studied wine before I studied whiskey. And so to be able to get these really interesting, meaty kind of red wine going into, Burgundy and Bordeaux, it was just really, really incredible to me. And to your point as well, they play really well with sherry. I can balance out a lot of really heavy sherry notes. But it's also, I mean, typically we say, or people have found or studied or that women can smell and taste more than men. We don't necessarily know why that is. I feel like it's kind of a hunter versus gatherer. I feel like, men, the job was like, if it's moving, hit it over the head and then we're going to eat it. And for women, it was like, I have to know the difference between poison and not poison. And so you kind of like developed these different senses of taste and smell. And I liken it to, a lot of people maybe in high school had a bad whiskey experience. It probably wasn't very expensive whiskey, but it probably was American whiskey. And maybe it was like 10, 15, 20 bucks a bottle. And Islay whiskey couldn't be farther from that experience. It's just kind of like a complete 180. And so I found, I ran a pub for a long time that specifically if women came in and said, oh, I don't like whiskey, I had this terrible such and such experience when I was 18, I could put an art bag or something in front of them, or a spring bank or a, whatever. And they'd go, oh, this doesn't smell like whiskey. This doesn't taste like whiskey. I don't know what it is. And I'm not sure that I like it, but wow, there's a lot going on. And it seemed like an easier gateway drug, especially for women, which I was always really interested in getting more women comfortable, specifically with Scotch. So I love it. And the island's just amazing.
You're right on all. I shouldn't say you're right. That's condescending, and I don't mean it that way. You're right that women, they just do. You just have better sensitive smell than us guys do. It's you can't argue with it. I really don't think you can argue with it. My wife, who does not drink whiskey at all, unless it's in like a whiskey ginger or a whiskey sour, I won't give her any peated stuff. But if it's something else, and I'm just like, I can't figure out what this note is. It sounds so familiar. It tastes and smells so familiar. I'll just hand it over to her, and she'll put it about a foot from her face and say, oh yeah, this is what that is. I'm like, God damn it, how did you do that? And like I said, she doesn't like any of this stuff. She'll drink wine and ciders, but not whiskey. So anything peated, she's like, oh God, what is that? But maybe one day.
Maybe one day.
I am with you though. I'm trying to do a like a walkthrough. I was telling you before, I was trying to do a tasting set, but I also want to do a walkthrough for myself of the Isla distilleries and really understand what the profiles are, knowing I'm not going to like everything, but just understanding. So Bowmore, after I did it, came off as very ashy to me. Whereas Kalila, I got what you were describing as that really fatty, pork and, sticking your face in a smoker kind of thing where the fat's just dripping onto the coals and vaporizing. And I loved it. Ardbeg has kind of been in the middle for me. I can sometimes get more meatiness and sometimes a little less. Depends on the release, and they've got so many. Laga is about my max on the peat, but I love Octomore. As you were saying, it's much more smoky than what we think is peaty. And even taking into account that the ppm levels are probably measured pre-malting, let alone post distillation.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So even taking that, it probably is the most peated, whatever that means, if you're measuring by ppms, I guess. But whatever. I do really like Octomore is the point, and the Black Art series that they did as well. And I've been trying to do that because I want to understand. Now that I can deal with peat and understand it, I want to really understand what are these profiles and can I identify them? Because I suck at identifying. I'm good at identifying flavors. I suck at identifying what distillery something is from.
Some of that is bullshit. I mean, it's crazy to me that somebody, 20 plus years of tasting whiskey and sitting on tasting panels and stuff, that I would be like, oh, this reminds me so much of the Ardbeg, the original Ergnon Bish, but not possibly the one 2 years later. We can continue to identify scent. Scent is most closely linked to memory. So a particular scent, if it's really distinct, and that's a through line for something, absolutely. But to be able to say like release on release or year on year or something else, I mean, there's so few people. People would be shocked. I mean, especially in blind tastings and a number of the panels that I do. This most recent one that we just held the inaugural New Orleans Spirits competition, which was in conjunction with a nonprofit Tales of the Cocktail. And we were short some people. So I volunteered, was in the back room on the last day, helping flight things and direct traffic. And I was watching people taste, and I knew what it was. And it was mind-boggling when people go, oh, I know what this is. This is this, And I'm like, okay, wait until, the best tasting rye in that competition was Rittenhouse. People were flabbergasted. Mm-hmm. Like, how often have you tasted it? How often do you drink it? But do you go back and really break it down and, know what Rittenhouse is? Probably not. I mean, people are shocked. And granted, I mean, David, there are things that are extremely distinct that you'll always know, exactly what it is, but that's BS.
I am so glad to hear you say that, because now I don't feel as bad about sucking at that. So that's
no, I mean, the thing is, it's more about that scent memory and flavor memory. And so to me, it's eat every food you can get your hand on, eat every, like, what's in season right now, like fruits and vegetables and like eat them in isolation and eat them raw and eat them sauteed and eat them this way, like all those different things. And then be conscious of it. Like, look at it, like a physical sense of it. What does it smell like? What does it taste like? And isolate all those things and commit to letting that like imprint on your brain. And that's the only way to build that sense. I mean, is to build that memory bank, of all those things. I mean, it's hard. And like if you've been to Scotland, there's notes that exist in Scotland. Like if you're talking about Scottish tablet or treacle, or like, have you had Scottish tablet before?
Would I know it by a different name?
No, it's called Scottish tablet. It looks like vanilla fudge. So it comes in squares, but it's like a little bit drier and it's kind of butterscotchy. It's kind of like a roasted sugary. It's amazing with whiskey. It's really, really good, but it's called tablet. And if you've never had it, and you can order it through like Scottish Gourmet USA or something like that. But if you haven't had it, or treacle, or like in Scotland, Smarties are not like what we think of as Smarties. They're like a generic M&M.
Yes, that what I knew. Treacle,
right.
Treacle I'm more familiar with too.
Yeah. So there's just like some things where you're like, oh, I know exactly what that is. But like, if you haven't had it, how would you ever identify it? It drives me crazy to read tasting notes that are so snotty and distinct that you read it and go, I have no idea what you're talking about. Just like the colors, like an amberana sunset in Queens, on a Monday night. Like, right. I don't know what that means.
Yeah. The one that I always think of is maybe last year, Woodford came out, and, Woodford's got the whole 200 plus notes on the tasting wheel and all that, which in itself is ridiculous. No one's tasting 200 things. If you are, you don't have the time to taste all those things before the whiskey is either gone, evaporated, or your palate is dead.
Right.
But one of the notes was like, it was a golden citrine. And I'm like, it's a really, really fancy term for it was yellowish, like
yellowish doesn't really read well.
Right. It doesn't, but you can find something in between that's a little more to your point. It's a little more understandable and relatable to someone. And I mean, I know I expanded my vocabulary mostly by tasting, but also by reading reviews. I think this fits particularly from UK based publishers, where they would have, they would focus on all these English and Scottish desserts and foods and things that were very unique to the Isles. And I'm like, I've never tasted these things before. So, some of them I had tasted. I mean, I've never had a whiskey that tasted like haggis. I do like haggis. If I don't know what I'm eating, I like haggis. Thankfully, I never had a whiskey that tasted like it, but I could identify that as, okay, it's earthy, it's offal-ish. There's something to it. But one of the ones that got me was petrichor, which I understand what it is. And I was told I think it was by Lou Bryson, actually, that was used because you have 80 words in a review, and you can say it smells or tastes like the earth or the dirt after a rainstorm as things dry out. But that's a lot of words, and petrichor is just one. So I get that. And whenever I use it, I'm like, do I have room here? Should I really explain what that is?
I was walking down the street in Chicago on a super hot day and it rained the next day. And I have to remind myself of what that word means. I think it's a beautiful word and it's very distinct. And even thinking about it can call up that scent memory. I mean, that's kind of when you know that you've got it. But I was walking down the street the other day as it started to rain, and the rain hitting the warm ground. And I just thought, okay, petrichor, and just kind of like be in the moment, take in the smell, take in the feeling of all of it, and just remind yourself what it is. So it's about being mindful. It also is hard to shut that off. And I know you write a lot of tasting notes. So it's like sometimes not so fun, probably not with your partner or like non-industry people out to dinner that are like, oh my God, can you not just like drink and eat and enjoy it?
I can shut it off when I need to for that. But otherwise, like, I want to taste everything. I want to write my notes on and be like, ooh, what am I getting this time? What am I getting the second time? And compare, because I love that. And one of the other ones that I wanted to hit on, and then we'll move on. But look, we've already established we're probably going to have you on multiple times because this is just fun. I'm having fun. I hope you're having fun.
I'm having fun.
Okay. One that I got hooked on was sultanas, which, apples to apples is just golden raisins. But, and I put that to John as well when I was on his podcast, and I said, if I'm being hoity-toity about it, I could just say golden raisins. Like, people are going to have to look up what a sultana is. They're going to know what a golden raisin is. But he pointed out to me the reverse, which is there are connotations to it. a sultana I think of as this very sweet, decadent, and complex dried white grape flavor. Whereas if I say golden raisin, I'm thinking more like the boxes of, I forget what brand it is, but the boxes of raisins you get as a kid, and you just pick them out. And there is a difference between those two.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, might be nitpicky or seem really specific to some people, but for me, those are different notes.
I'm with you. It also, though, this goes back to memory, David, is like, those are called sun-made raisins in the red box.
Thank you. Sun-made, yes.
My mom convinced us for a long time that was dessert.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a trick. And like, when you find out that dessert is actually like chocolate and, like cupcakes, then you feel really tricked. And so I don't have the happiest memories of raisins. Also, put raisins in my carrot cake, I'm going to kill you. Like, not cool. But then sultana, it just sounds, it sounds decadent. That's the right word for it. And when I've had it in desserts, in the UK, it's like perfectly placed and they're wonderful. And I've always had positive experiences with it. So it's like sultana makes me smile and raisin makes me think like disappointment.
That's fair. I'll have the raisins in the carrot cake. Just hold the coconut because it won't kill me, but it'll definitely make it really unpleasant.
Yeah. Mean.
Doesn't belong. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Anyway, but yeah, I think of like a sultana. You can also plump it with something. So I've had a couple notes where it's like a sultana if you soaked it in a juniper forward gin, or if you soaked it in Sauterne and just doubled up on those flavors, and that sensation of biting into a grape or raisin that's been rehydrated, that you get that intense grape flavor, but also whatever it's been rehydrated with. And those two work really well together. So I'm glad to hear that it's not in my head, and that someone with objectively better olfactory senses is going to also pick up the same kinds of things. I am definitely going to order some Scottish tablet too.
Oh, you got to do it.
In addition to that book. So I'm making a list, because I always do with guests. I make lists and I write notes. Yep. So the main topic for this episode that I wanted to bring you on for was, again, it's sherry. And if you're listening and you're a drinker of American spirits, Scottish spirits, any of the major five and all the other countries that produce whiskeys, I hope that you know what sherry is. But just in case, let's do a quick rundown of what sherry is, and then we can kind of go into the categories of it afterwards.
Yeah, so absolutely.
Take it away.
Yeah. And I mean, you don't want to go into it with too much depth. There are people who do it 100 times better than I could. There's whole books on the topic. And again, to me, it truly does not click until you go. But in the very near term, I think really valuable if you find that you like sherried whiskeys. So whiskeys fully matured in sherry, any kind of sherry, or finished in sherry, is to get a hold of those bottles of sherry and taste them next to those whiskeys. So it's easy to find a bottle of Oloroso, certainly a Fino, even though that's less used, maybe Amontillado, Palo Cortado, and PX is kind of the classic one everybody thinks of, the one that's super raisiny, for lack of a better term. But really, sherry is just, it's an aberration of a word that's like the town that's kind of the center of sherry production, which is Jerez, Jerez. And so it's like an Americanized, anglicized version of that word is sherry. It's a category of fortified wine. So if you think of fortified wine, what does the word fortification mean? It's literally like fortifying a castle. So you're going to put like little protections around your castle. So you have like a moat and a drawbridge and some buckets of oil. All those things are fortifications. So sherry at base, along with port and Madeira and vermouth, which is also aromatized, they're wines that are then fortified, strengthened with something to give them longer life. So if you just have like a still red wine or a still white wine, those are often going to be bottled at 11, 12 to 14, 15%. If you open them, they're going to be off in a couple of days. It's also sad. If you just have a bottle of wine sitting around for a couple of days, you need to get some more fronts and drink it up. But so when you fortify it, you're literally just trying to strengthen it to give it longer life. And so you typically will then add a distilled brandy to that wine to bump the alcohol percentage up to like the low 20s. And that can extend the life of that wine into, a couple of months. And then hopefully if you're refrigerating it, maybe even a little bit longer. So the I mean, those are just the basics. There's really just a couple different grapes that it comes from. The still wine made from those grapes is not necessarily that exciting. This is wine that tends to be good for maturing as wine, but also good for distilling into brandy. And so it's the combination of the two that kind of makes it a little bit more exciting. And then they mature well. So they stand up well to wood maturation, which if you're into just still wine, some people really like an oaky Chardonnay. A lot of people don't. It can't withstand years of oak, or red wines that you see now being aged in big oak barrels. They typically can just take like a touch of it, but not years of it, like a Solera system in sherry production can provide. So a few different styles. The lightest is Fino, and it is, typically used as a pre-meal, an aperitif style wine. It's amazing with oysters and just kind of salty and briny and light and bright, and you kind of have like little really, really cold sips of it to get hungry. And then you traditionally go into an Oloroso style, which is more known for being really nutty, can smell very sweet, but doesn't typically taste particularly sweet. It has been found over time to be just, I would say, kind of the classic that people think of when they taste it. So it was the most widely consumed. Probably 80% of the consumers were drinking that through the 1700s, 1800s, maybe up through early 1900s even. And with that, you had production of lots and lots of producers making it, but also lots of it maturing, and then lots of barrels of it traveling, which made it, as the most popular type, the easiest to get a hold of the barrels to mature spirits in, so to mature Scotch in. And then really like the most fortified, biggest of the basic types is Pedro Jimenez, the Jimenez with an X. So it's called PX for short, if you can't pronounce it. And that is like a big syrupy, raisiny bomb. And it's the nose that you really associate with sherry. It just smells like squished up raisins or sultanas. And you don't typically see full maturations in PX. It's really strong. So you'll see well done finishes. Oloroso kind of for the longest term maturation. And then, maybe some things in Fino, maybe some in Palo Cortado, maybe some in some other styles. So those are the basics.
The Whiskey Ring podcast is proudly sponsored by Impex Beverages. Impex imports premium and rare whiskey, gin, rum, mezcals, liqueurs, and cordials from all over the world, from Scotland to Japan to Israel, Belgium, and Wales. Whether it's Kilchoman, Penderyn, Port Escaig, Glenallachie, Ohishi, Fukano, M&H, Ardnamurchan, Black Tot, and more, there's guaranteed to be something in the Impex portfolio you'll love. Impex also oversees some of the most prestigious independent bottlers in the game, including Single Malts of Scotland, Single Cask Nation, Adelphi Selection, and its own Impex collection. Take a look at their site, impexbev.com, or reach out if you're curious about their offerings. I'm proud to have many of their bottles on my shelves and love sharing them with friends whenever I can. Thank you to Sam and to the team for joining the Whiskey Ring podcast as guest and sponsor. And now, a word from our newest sponsor. The most exclusive whiskey in the world can't be bought in a store. Born in Edinburgh, the Scotch Malt Whisky Society is the world's largest whiskey club, with over 30,000 members worldwide. They bottle each cask of whiskey as is. No diluting, no artificial coloring, or chill filtration. With new whiskeys released every week, the Scotch Malt Whisky Society offers the opportunity to taste spirits straight from the cask. I've been a member for over 2 years now, and I've loved the chance to explore my favorite distilleries with truly unique offerings, in particular from distilleries 4 and 53, and discovering new single malts not available anywhere else. Not a Scotch fan? No problem. The Scotch Malt Whisky Society releases 20-plus bottles each month to its members, including, yes, Scotch, but also including gin, bourbon, rum, and more. In fact, my favorite recent bottling was a corn whiskey from the largest family-owned distillery in the U.S., aged 11 years in new oak and bottled at cask strength. This is a bottling that people have clamored for years, and it was only available to Scotch Malt Whisky Society members. If you're interested in joining, the Scotch Malt Whisky Society has graciously offered a discount to listeners of this podcast. Use code WRP, short for Whiskey Ring Podcast, at checkout for 20% off an annual membership at smwsa.com. That stands for Scotch Malt Whisky Society of America. I will also be putting the link and code in my bio and show notes for this and upcoming episodes. Thank you to the Scotch Malt Whisky Society for joining the Whiskey Ring Podcast as our newest sponsor. And please visit smwsa.com with code WRP for 20% off your annual membership. Yeah, I'm thinking back. I've definitely seen a couple in the lesser used categories, like the Fino, the Amontillado, the Palo Cortado. But yeah, mostly you're probably going to be dealing with an Oloroso or a PX if you're drinking whiskey. And I mean, I love them both. I got to try them straight at a restaurant last year for the first time. And when you get to do that, it's really eye-opening, as you're pointing out. You know, the I think it was a Fino and then the Oloroso and the PX. The Fino, as you said, very bright, very not what you think of as a fortified wine, or at least not what I thought of. I was expecting something that was going to be richer, more like the Oloroso and the PX, and it was instead much brighter. Mm-hmm. And then the Oloroso was exactly what I expected, thankfully, because I love Oloroso. That sweetness on the nose that then turns into more of a dry sweetness. Baking spices, red fruits, tons of red fruits. A nuttiness from the rancio in the background, especially almonds and hazelnuts. I love that. And yeah, the PX was just, to me, it was just like syrup. It was I think about a 20% ABV, and just it was served room temperature and it was still syrupy. I can't imagine what it would be if it was chilled first. It would just be viscous as hell, and probably delicious. But yes, most of the ones we'll see, you're going to use a PX for a finish, but Oloroso is going to be the main one for that long-term aging.
Yeah, definitely. I'd say too, I know it's kind of an expensive thought, to go and buy bottles of sherry, and maybe you can find half bottles, but if you get a group together that's into doing this as well, and you maybe have like one bottle each of 3 expressions of scotch that are finished in that, and then a bottle each of that, you could do a tasting like that, which is really fun. And to your point, David, it's extremely eye-opening, because I think people don't realize sometimes the notes coming from the scotch itself and what it is actually like accumulating from the whiskey and the barrel. So there are a lot of people that they love Oloroso matured scotches, but they're like, oh, I just like Oloroso. Like, I didn't know that all those things, those red fruits and the nutty notes and everything else that I was like assigning to the whiskey, it's because it's aged in a great sherry barrel.
Right. And we're used to, even as scotch drinkers, we're used to the malt. If it's put in an ex-bourbon barrel, which the majority of them are for part or all of the maturation, you're not going to get a lot from the barrel. We get a little bit of the butteriness, maybe some of the oak backbone, but most of it's going to come from the malt itself, just maturing over those years, especially if it's a second or third fill. You get less and less from the cask. So in that case, you get that very pale color. What you think of generally as just a scotch. I always go to like a Glenmorangie or Glenfiddich, where it's pretty pale, even at 12, 14, 16 years, and you get the maltiness. Add in sherry, and you start getting the redder amber hues and things like that. And it does have a much better expression of the types of sherry. And I think malt uniquely among the grains most used for whiskey production, malt can really stand up to those. Mm-hmm. And even I've only seen maybe 1 or 2 that were full maturation PX. To your point, it's too strong. It just overwhelms everything. But with an Oloroso, like finding something that's a cask strength Oloroso finish for 12, 14 years or so is perfect for me. Mm-hmm. I love that match. I got a 16, one of the Highland Parks I was a 16-year-old all Oloroso matured from the Whiskey Exchange, and I can't wait to go back to London and get another one of those, or 2 if there are any left. But the point being that in American whiskeys, we expect a lot to come from the barrel, because that's supposedly where all the flavor comes, or 60, 80%, whatever it is, so the flavor comes from. Whereas in others, when you're using used barrels, be it ex-bourbon or ex-sherry, you are getting from the barrel, but it's highly dependent on what you're using. So with the, so you were mentioning, that was a roundabout way of getting back to, you were mentioning earlier that sherry was transported. It was heavily drunk in the 1700s, 1800s, even till relatively recently. It's since fallen out of favor, I think, and we can explore
Really
why
out of fashion.
Out of fashion. That's really the better way to put it. Yeah. And we can explore that too. Was it just a natural progression that sherry became the vessel most used for whiskey maturation? Was it just coming down to those barrels being available?
I mean, it comes down to the Scots being cheap. That's all there is to it. Ask anyone you have on. So sherry and port and claret and Madeira and all those things were traveling over from those countries in transport casks, which are completely different from sherry casks now. So transport casks were still being used into the 1920s, 30s, maybe 40s. Much thicker staves. They were intended, to be out on the high sea, for many months coming over. And they came over full of wine when that was still legal. I mean, when you didn't have to bottle, in the country of origin to be able to keep the designations intact. So as we assign these DOs, part of it was it needs to be bottled here, which is great for those glass producers and for jobs in those countries and for keeping the integrity and the reason why you have the DO. But preceding that, and you'd have to look at the DOs for all those different categories, everything came over from those countries in massive volume to, the middle class to the wealthy all over the UK in those casks. And nobody in the world outside of the US was drinking bourbon. There was no eye towards using American oak for anything. We weren't sending barrels of bourbon, really very many places because people weren't really drinking that much whiskey. So it was more that you had this production of whiskey. And going back 100 years, almost all the single malt was going into blends. Nobody was making single malt or vintage, malts. It was grocers largely. So if you go back to the origins of, Justerini and Brooks and Johnny Walker and Dewar's, those were families of grocers, generational grocers that would receive in barrels of these fortified wines. And the barrel of fortified wine, just like now when you go to the store and you can go, get your own, grab a bag or a container and get nuts, it's like that kind of thing. You went in with your little jug and you went and got sherry or port. And so they always had those casks. And then they would actually get barrels of malt. And so let's just say, and this is a total exaggeration, this would probably not actually happen, but let's just say that you're John Walker and John Walker's son, and you get a barrel, 1 week of, Cardew, and the next week, you need another barrel of whiskey and you're grabbing a Tom and Towel. And the next week, somehow you get a Talisker, something that maybe is peaty briny. Your customers are kind of you have all these different things made from these same ingredients and da-da-da. And so over time, they started picking out these strong qualities from these different single malt distilleries, started blending them together. They legalized using column distilled, essentially more neutral grain spirit, to kind of do the bulk, the filling, the bulk spirit, and then start using those single malts as, the spices and the salt and pepper. And then as they were blending things literally in the store, you'd have these sherry casks, port casks, and the bulk of it was sherry. I mean, that was the consumption. That was what was inexpensive to drink. And it was Oloroso sherry and transport casks. The only place you can really still see those, not surprisingly, is at Gordon MacPhail. So if you go through Gordon MacPhail in Elgin, that's why they have 70 plus year old single malt to bottle for tens of thousands of dollars, is because they're in transport casks and they filled those. So they would take those transport casks to Macallan, Glen Grant, Glenlivet, Strathyla, fill them. And now 70, 80 plus years on, they're still sitting on them. But that was kind of the last time those transport casks were coming. And
these are really casks that, like you said, they're thicker. They're not what we think of as a barrel for whiskey today. They're over twice as big as a traditional bourbon barrel. Right. And not really meant, it's not meant to impart flavor to the whiskey. It's meant to transport it. There might be some flavor transport, but it's really meant to transport. The first time it's used, there's going to be quite a bit of it. I think too, you brought up the point earlier, and I think you're exactly right. Malt is a great canvas for sherry. It's a very different canvas than bourbon, obviously a corn-based whiskey, but traditionally column distilled versus malt being copper pot distilled, mostly 2 times. So there's this oiliness and this viscousness and this backbone of all those things, where a lot of that I feel kind of gets stripped out, in a grain whiskey like bourbon. And so it's, bourbon can't spend, in Kentucky, it can't spend
50 years in a sherry cask and expect to taste good like you might have a scotch that can survive that long.
Absolutely. And that's why it drives me so crazy now seeing some of these scotch producers rather, chill filtering the whiskey. And I know that's a whole other argument, but
that's the 4th episode we're doing.
I know. But I look at it and I think malt has such a unique character to it that has that oiliness that can stand up. It's a strong grain without necessarily being a strong flavor. It's not like it's going to overpower the sherry, but it's going to play really well together. And then you chill filter it and you're taking out all those oils that have, accumulated those fat soluble molecules and esters over the years. And it's like, what are you doing?
It's funny, David, like people who chill filter will be very defensive of it and say it doesn't do anything. And then all the people that don't do it say that it absolutely has a huge impact on it. I'm totally a believer in non-chill filtration. And
me too. Yeah. I've been told multiple occasions, my reviews, if over the long term, mouthfeel is the biggest determinant for me of whether I'm going to like something. If something is chill filtered when it's not supposed to be, I'm going to notice it because it should have a viscous mouthfeel. It should have a mouthfeel, period. If it just
mouthfeel, not having a mouthfeel can kill it. The other thing too is that what are you left with when you taste something? The finish,
right?
And the determining factor of how long the finish and how intense and how long those flavors stick around, is going to be based on texture and viscosity.
And oddly, this really works. I'm just coming back as recording. I'm just coming back from a trip to Kentucky and Tennessee, and one of the places I stopped at was Jack Daniel's. And as we're going through the tour and tasting different things, one of the things they pointed out was Gentleman Jack, which they do the regular they do the regular mellowing through the sugar maple charcoal, the regular 10 feet that they would do for any of the products. And then they do it again at the end of maturation through 3 feet instead of 10 feet, 3 feet of the sugar maple charcoal. And the guy literally said, and he was otherwise so good, except for this one thing. He said, if you notice, you drink it and it's very, very smooth. There's not much of a finish. And I'm just thinking to myself, then what's the point? Drink vodka. Like there should be something. It doesn't have to be super coating. It can vary depending on your taste, but I want to know that the whiskey has been there.
I just want to abolish, like, smooth is not a tasting note. It isn't really, it's like, is something smooth versus not smooth, but oh my gosh, it drives me completely insane when somebody says, isn't this smooth? Like, isn't it the smoothest, blah, blah, blah. I'm like, oh, no.
I think it's one of those terms that I'll put alongside young, smooth, and oaky. I think those are my 3 things that I'm okay with you using them, but you have to explain what you mean.
I don't like it when people call their whiskey juice. It drives me bananas. The juice, juice, what we did with the juice. You buying this juice? I might slip up and use that once or twice. So I apologize in advance because I do use that sometimes. I'll forgive you.
I do use that sometimes. But I'm okay with using those terms, but you've got to say, like, if you're saying something is smooth, I want to know, does that mean that it has no proof burn? There's no oak pepperiness, or if it's oaky, do you mean it's creamy, peppery, woody? There's all these different things that oaky can mean or smooth can mean. And if you describe it, I'm good.
Yeah, I'm with you. I totally get that. Yeah. I think that, that is a really good way of looking at it. Back to sherry, I think the maybe one of the biggest misnomers is that people think that things that are aged in sherry barrels are aged in not transport barrels, but similar barrels to what they would have been matured in the 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, even 80s. And going back not quite 100 years, you still would have largely been using Spanish oak, which is a different type of oak versus American oak. And you still would have been there still would have been enough consumption to drive real, Oloroso sherry being aged in a Solera system and getting a hold of some of those really like intensely sherried barrels, getting pulled out of a system after 20, 40, 60, 80 years of service. Mm-hmm. And now most of the barrels that are used in sherry production it's almost, to oversimplify it, it's like a lot of the companies that use a lot of sherry maturation, they're actually cutting down the trees in the Ozarks, sending American oak over to Spain, having it seasoned with perfectly good quality Oloroso sherry for 6 months or 8 months. And then that sherry, probably could be bottled and used for cooking sherry, probably just as well. The rent has been paid, dumped down a drain. And then those barrels are shipped to Scotland to mature a lot of whiskey. So that's a very different animal. So it's no longer mostly Spanish oak. It's actually very little Spanish oak, but it's mostly American oak now. So you're still going to get some of those notes that you get from a fresh bourbon barrel. I mean, you're still going to get pantones, lactones, coconutty things, all that kind of stuff can still come through in sherry, and it manifests itself a little bit differently. But I think that's kind of a big misnomer, is that there are people that think, oh yeah, this is all the same thing, that's been going on this entire time. It's incredibly different. And whenever people say, no, like that can't be, or, I would say, I don't, being a tasting a few hundred people, how many of you drink sherry? Like 3 people raise their hands. Well, if you're not drinking sherry, who do you think is driving this market for the maturation, of what's going into those barrels? And it's a little bit eye-opening, I think, for people sometimes to realize what we like about sherry matured whiskeys right now doesn't probably have anything to do with Spanish oak, or with Oloroso having been in it for 20, 30, 40 years. Right.
And I think you're spot on with that. There are a lot of different things that have changed over the years with, grain styles and wood management and all that. And I do want to start trying a couple more things that are in Spanish oak. I feel like I've tried plenty of things in French oak, specifically Limousine, but French in general, Mizunara, American oak, of course, from different regions. I can't get behind Gariana. I just don't like Gariana. But also Jamaican allspice wood. It's hard to find things, like the Tennessee Tasters has one that's in there, but it's hard to find because it can only be from Jamaica. But tasting different wood types and seeing what those impart can also really expand the flavor profile. And to your point, what do you get with what kind of lactones are you getting? Is it more of a coconutty thing, or is it more suntan lotion, and that'll really depend on where is that all coming from, what's it been exposed to, what's the cycle look like, its life cycle look like. So with chair is squeaking like crazy.
I can't hear it. You just outed yourself. You just outed your chair.
I did. I'm sorry. I will oil you later. I'm sorry. Speaking of the chair. So with sherry production. So when did we really see this decline and a coming out of fashion to drink sherry?
I think it's going into, that's probably, it's kind of hard to pinpoint, but it's not like people really drank it in the States. You really have to look at UK consumption, because in the States, It would have traveled over with people coming from the UK around that same time period, and not necessarily expanded all the way across the US. But I would say even kind of going into that Mad Men era, that kind of like cocktail era, that vodka era, the more like wanting to drink, more neutral spirits and things, I think really fell out of favor. There are still people that drink a lot of sherry, but they're probably 80 or 90 years old. Yep. And I'd like people to get more into it. It's so brilliant, but it really does. It definitely takes food. But so I'd say you're kind of like, you're really falling off in the 40s and 50s.
Okay. And I forget whether it was on air or before we were talking, I was talking about, the first time I even heard sherry was watching Frasier. And every time Niles came in, Niles, a sherry? You like that?
Does that make it seem cool or hip to you?
No. It makes it seem funny to me, but
yes.
I have tried to look this up and I haven't been able to find an answer. So I'll throw it to you. What kind of sherry do you think they were drinking, or were showing to try to drink?
I still think it was a lot of Oloroso sherry. I don't think, it's pretty, Fino doesn't really it doesn't last that long. So you still had things, you see people pouring it. It was in decanters. It wasn't well sealed. It wasn't like they kept it refrigerated. For a lot of that time, we didn't have refrigerators. So, think about it. It had to be something a little bit more fortified, a little bit bigger. As something like Oloroso starts to go off, it's not poison, but some of the sweetness in those things intensifies. Some of the rancio intensifies. People would still drink it, so I think it was largely Oloroso and PX. It would have been getting into those darker, bigger, and Amontillado as well. Really, those 3 would have been the ones that wouldn't show off notes, or go completely bad, before people could finish drinking them.
Fair. I'm going to have to grab a couple because now I have to do a tasting of them for myself and with people, because I can't drink 6-7 bottles of sherry by myself. I could, but I'd fall behind on way too many things. So
there's so much to do. And I think too, one other point, David, that is interesting, because you talked about this a little bit earlier, is talking about flavor development in barrels, and the number of uses, yes, super important. But I think maybe even more important, and one of the things that has really, really changed in, I don't know, maybe like the past, let's call it 30 years. When you think about shipping a bourbon barrel intact to Scotland, that is not nearly as common now, because you can ship over 5 times as many barrels if you break them down to staves. If you break them down into staves, you've got dry staves. Once they arrive, you coop a completely different barrel, but there's no integrity to the bourbon that's in it. It's kind of what the bourbon did to the wood and what's left in the wood and the char and the red layer and all of that. It's a very different animal if you're choosing the added expense of wanting the integrity of the bourbon or the integrity of the sherry to be left in place through that transport. So you're going to actually leave the barrel wet. It's going to move over quickly. You're actually going to get potentially even some of the liquid that's still left in the barrel, but you're certainly going to get some of like what's left wet in the staves is going to be very impactful to the whiskey. So, I mean, I think that there's a lot of variance in terms of bourbon's impact, former bourbon barrels impact, whether they're hogsheads or rebuilt barrels or whatever it is. And I think the same thing in terms of sherry, you're going to get very, very different influences.
So just to tease people a little bit, which I promised we would do before we started talking, which is, a couple of the other topics that I had on for Monique before we start are, how's the American finishing scene going? Because we think of sherry, we immediately associate with Scotch, maybe a couple other states, but really not the U.S. As you were saying, the U.S. was never a big drinker of sherry. It was mainly European drinkers. So, how's the American finishing scene looking with sherry, with other finishes as well? But I'm particularly interested with sherry. And then how does American single malt fit in? Because now you've got malt-based whiskey being in American style, whatever that means, distillery by distillery, and then finished in a sherry or any other cask. And what does that mean for the finishing scene as well? So there are a couple other topics that we're going to hit on. We've also got peat. I mean, you're a fount of information, so we've got a lot of things that we can go into. But before you
got to fact check me after, and then call me on all my bullshit next time, and then we'll really dive into it.
I mean, I might do that off air. I'm not big on calling people on bullshit. Like, I'll mention that something was wrong. I didn't pick up on anything wrong so far, and I'm certainly not in a position to be like, I think that sherry producers, I don't think they're dumping it down the drain. I know they are, so I'm not going to fact check you on that. But so one of the last things to ask was, you mentioned that a lot of these, I shouldn't say a lot because I don't know the number or the percentage, but a number of sherry producers are really just producing sherry to season barrels that are then sent to Scotland, and then the sherry is just dumped because there's not the market for it that it was. In some ways I'm kind of surprised by that, because I think they would want to showcase their product. They want to say it was made from this bodega in Jerez, and I promised myself I was going to say that right. This bodega in Jerez that paired well with this particular Scotch distillery or this malt style or this smoke style. But we don't see that. We see a tarp thrown over it. We don't know where the sherry casks are coming from other than that area, because they have to be from that area. We don't know what the bodegas are, with very rare exceptions. Like I look at Redbreast from Ireland doing the Lustau edition. Other than that, it's very difficult. And I like the idea that you proposed, which is you should try the sherry, you should try the wines and the finishes by themselves. So then you understand what the whiskey is being finished in. But I do see that there's a barrier to that, just because we don't know in many cases where it's coming from.
I think to have the phrase that you just used, like throwing a tarp over it, is brilliant. And I think you're exactly spot on. Part of what I did when I lived there is I was providing a bridge, kind of a throughput from the Scotch whiskey industry into the sherry industry, because they literally do not speak the same language. But when largely in Spain, from their perspective, all the reason that everybody's buying these barrels is not about respect for the liquid that was in them. It's about what it does to the wood so that they can mature Scotch in them. Right. And then from like the Scottish side, it's like, oh, we're kind of over drinking the sherry part, and you guys are just making this crappy cooking sherry and dumping it down a drain anyway. But like, thanks for that. And it makes our Scotch taste really good. So it's like over time, all of that kind of mutual respect kind of fell off, because I think that used to be much, much more common, that you would really know who those producers were. But I guess I'd pose a question to you. I mean, do you think that drinking that Redbreast finished in Lustau causes someone to go buy a bottle of Lustau.
Most people probably not.
Right. So then is it worth, is it worth doing that? I love the idea. And I think if you could actually figure out, where this thing came from, you and I are a level of nerd that most people will never approach. Yes, I think that's really fascinating. I follow a lot of these, the Coopers there are called tonelerias. And so there's a couple that I follow even on Facebook, and you can see projects that they're working on and like what they're doing and, all these other things. But I think largely people don't care, and that on both sides, they don't think that people care. And I would say the same thing, actually, even in like American finishing, bourbon finishing, anything else, like to know the specific wine. I got an example. You and I were talking about it right when we got started. Hill Rock has, a distillery that we work with in upstate New York. They have very high level relationships with people that produce red wine, Napa Cab, that's $300 a bottle. When you're producing a $150 bottle of whiskey aged in a barrel that held $30,000 worth of wine or whatever it is, that's appealing on both sides. You're a person who can afford to drink a super premium bottle of American malt or bourbon whiskey, but also the land grab is getting that cab drinker to want to drink that whiskey. Mm-hmm. So it's different. Like, you're not going to grab a Lustau drinker is not going to go, I'm going to spend $150 on this bottle of Redbreast. So it's like, it's just, it's just interesting times. I think that if the Scotch industry or the sherry industry thought that it would drive more business, they would probably happily disclose that information. I just don't know if it actually would work.
I know. I really hope they do. I know we're coming up on time, but I really hope they do. Like, there are a couple of distilleries that I'm going to be talking to. Ironclad, which will probably be an episode or two before this one, out of Virginia. They do a Petit Verdot finish. We know which winery it is, Flying Fox Winery. I tried to get the bottle of the Petit Verdot. They were out. So I got to wait till next year's harvest, but next year's vintage, but we'll see. But the point being that you can, in that case, you can taste what the actual wine is. You can taste the intentionality, which I know is a big thing, and is also another one of the episodes that we may do in the future, all about intentionality. So with that, we'll close out because I want to just have a minute or two after to make sure we're all set going forward. But in the meantime, Monique, thank you so much for coming on, for giving us this really, quick but deep dive into what sherry is, what it means for whiskey, the kind of state of the industry, if you will, between sherry and Scotch and what it means. Also just exploring the history of it. And I really look forward to having you back on in the future for hopefully many episodes to talk about many other things with other guests, without other guests. You're always welcome on. So thank you for coming on.
Thanks, David. I appreciate it. This is a lot of fun. This is a good cap to my day. I'm not normally drinking whiskey at the end of my Mondays, but today was a great excuse too.
Fair enough. So, in the meantime, any social media tags you want to throw out? Any website or anything? Nope.
I've gone kind of like dark. I'm on all the social media stuff, but I stopped posting. Something about COVID just like knocked it out of me. I hit like on things, which I enjoy, but I'm out there. People can find me if they want.
All good. And I'll put a couple links to, Winebow, to some of the things we've talked about in the episode. But thanks so much, Monique, for coming on. As always, follow Whiskey Ring Podcast, Whiskey My Wedding Ring, for tasting notes, putting out every day now. So keep up those website visits because they really do help. With that, see you next week.